welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell. Today we are going to discuss a powerful subject, what it takes to leave a church. And as always, we want to hear from you. Leave your comments in the Facebook chat below, or you can send them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Joining me for this discussion is FFRF's Digital Media Manager, Rowan Hahn. Welcome,
Hi.
Rowan. Rowan and I are actually really excited today to welcome our guest, Alyssa Grenfell. She's an ex-Mormon teacher and the author of the book, How to Leave the Mormon Church, an ex-Mormon's Guide to Rebuilding After Religion. And we're going to interview Alyssa all about her journey leaving the Mormon Church. We're going to talk about her book, her hugely popular ex-Mormon social media content, and more. So welcome to Ask an Atheist, Alyssa. Hi, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So Rowan, I said again, is our social media manager. And Rowan, you are the one who learned about Alyssa on YouTube and introduced her to me and others at FFRF. So why don't you talk about how you encountered Alyssa, and then you can go ahead and ask her your first question.
So as we mentioned, Alyssa is actually pretty popular online right now, especially with the sort of ex-Mormon area online, but with a lot of different people. And I really like her content because it's just very honest and forthright. And I kind of wanted to talk to you, why did you even want to start sharing your stories and talking both your criticisms of the Mormon Church as well as just your experiences with it online?
Yeah, so I left the Mormon Church about 8 years ago, and I was all in, as they say. I served a full-time Mormon mission. I was married in a Mormon temple. I went to BYU Provo. I literally checked every good Mormon girl box. And when I left, it was absolutely just identity crushing, because every part of my identity was built around Mormonism and trying to be a good Mormon, a good religious person as I saw it, and check all those boxes. And that was always this almost like safety blanket of how I knew I was a good person, was to do what the Mormon Church told me. And so when I left, I realized how crushing it was. And then after I left, I had a lot of other friends, especially during the pandemic. A lot of people were online. They had a lot of time to research. Tons of my friends who almost and really told me and revealed to me that they judged me for leaving, reached out to me and wanted to reconnect. And I saw them go through what I went through. And that inspired me to write my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church, which is a comprehensive guide of everything you might want to know as you leave the church, from choosing new underwear because you no longer wear garments, to ordering your first cocktail. And to promote the book, I started a TikTok account, started YouTube, and I was honestly, I still to this day, I'm just overwhelmed by the response, because just the number of views, I have, I think, more than 10, 15 videos with over 1 million views. One has 11 million. And so I think that it's connected with a lot of people, not just in the ex-Mormon community, but from a lot of Jehovah's Witness, ex-Muslims have reached out to me, people just across the religious spectrum who connect with what it's like to leave a church.
Yeah, that experience too of deconstructing when you're so sort of, like you said, your identity is so completely tied up in your experience in the religion, especially in a really insular religious community like the Mormon Church or the JWs. And that process of deconstructing can be sometimes, years of a person's life of leaving a church. So can you just talk a little bit, the short version, because obviously you wrote a whole book about it, but talk a little bit about your deconstruction process, like what happened, not what happened, but what was the process like of you experiencing doubts or, discordance with this religion that you were raised so heavily indoctrinated into, even up into your 20s and adulthood?
Yeah, so I just had several experiences throughout my early adulthood in my 20s where I made really, really life-changing, life-altering decisions based off of prayer and the emotional feeling I once believed was God speaking to me, and saw those choices just absolutely crash and burn. And in reflecting, realizing that had I just consulted my own brain, had I just thought it through all by myself, I would have actually made better choices than I did had I outsourced my decision making to prayer and God. And moments where I had received what I thought was just the most obvious direction and truth from God, only to realize it was just completely false. And so I had enough of those experiences stacked up that finally I allowed myself to think, maybe there isn't anyone on the other side giving me knowledge from on high. Maybe God doesn't exist. And that was the beginning of my deconstruction, which then led into a lot of Mormon church history, a lot of the ethics surrounding, the church's stance on gay marriage. And so it kind of unraveled from there, but it definitely started with these very strong experiences of relying on prayer, only to have it crash and burn later on.
So I know in a lot of your videos you sort of mention it, but a lot of ex-Mormons find it really hard to talk about some of the things about the church, and especially you go into a lot of detail about things that aren't necessarily supposed to be shared. Why have you found that important to kind of talk about online and in your book?
Yeah, so in my YouTube and TikTok, I talk a lot about the temple specifically, which is something that a lot of ex-Mormon content creators, but also just the ex-Mormon community at large, is very hesitant to talk about. First of all, because if you talk about this stuff, there's a much higher likelihood that you'll be cut off by your family. So it's one thing to leave the church, but then to speak about the most secret or sacred parts of Mormonism openly, that is definitely a much higher level of almost betrayal, I would say, or disrespect. But to me, the temple was in many ways one of the major aspects of Mormonism that made me recoil and feel so much like this religion is a cult disguised as Christianity that can be accepted by the larger culture. And I had such an awful experience in the temple, and then even going back, the way it made me feel, that I feel like to not talk about it feels wildly disingenuous. But then also for people to say, you shouldn't talk about this is disrespectful. It's almost like experiencing abuse and then having someone say like, hey, the abuser he's a really great guy and he's a great member of the community. So if you could just not talk about that, it's going to help a lot of people. So not that it's the same, I don't think I would say it was as extreme as abuse, but it feels almost along the same vein as being silenced in the name of protecting the organization that hurt you. And so that's why I believe so strongly in talking about it and in connecting with other people who have the exact same experience and who need to hear from other people that was what they felt it was. It was a very cultish ceremony that it shouldn't be surprising that it made them feel so awful.
I really appreciate that part of your videos because I feel like it is so important to be able to talk about these things openly so people can actually discuss them. And what I found very, very impactful has been your discussions of growing up as a woman in the church, and especially how they treated you and how they were expecting you to live your life. So sort of how was that, like, as we were talking about the deconstruction later, that part of it was very interesting to me, to sort of leave behind what the church was expecting of you as a woman.
Yeah, I think in many ways, Mormonism there's a document that was released when I was a kid. It's called the Proclamation of the Family, and it spells out very clearly just the most traditional gender roles. So men are responsible for protecting the home and providing money, supporting the family, household in that way. And women are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. And growing up, I received so many church lessons were just about finding the right husband, a returned missionary Mormon guy, and having kids, preparing to have a home, caring for the home and caring for the children, and even babysitting, babysitting all the time, being asked when the boys in the church were off playing basketball, the girls would be responsible for babysitting so that other women could go out or just have some sort of child care associated part of the religious experience. And so so much of my upbringing was about how to be a good mom, and that was my only objective. And then the other piece is modesty and purity, of course. Learning that, the way I can show God I love him is by covering my body. And that's God's message for women, is basically be a mom, cover your body, don't give away your virginity, basically. Excuse me. And so that is a lot to deconstruct as I was leaving. Even after I left, knowing I still wanted to have kids, but trying to figure out, is that urge just because I'm still partially Mormon, or is that because I am, is that because I really want to?
Yeah, I really, really liked the part of your book where you discussed, especially learning how to wear stuff that wasn't sort of church approved. And I really like as well, you included a excerpt from a man as well talking about his experience trying to not dress in a church way either. And I sort of wanted to ask about that. There are several instances in your book where you bring up these stories from other people that are not you, that have different experiences. And I was sort of curious how you found these people and why you found it important to also include their stories in the novel and not just your own.
Yeah, I think especially for the sexuality portion, I am heterosexual, and so it felt important to include two stories. I have one gay man and one lesbian who's my friend, just because if I'm going to write a guide about everything about leaving the church, I'm not going to be able to speak to that experience as well as my friends. And so I wanted to make sure that I'm bringing in as many voices as possible, especially when it comes to speaking to things that I don't have experience with and am not going to be able to voice as well as the people who have lived them. And then for my friend Levi, I just met him through the Reddit forum, and I think just hearing his experience, especially he's part Polynesian, and in Utah, the stereotypical Mormon guy is very skinny, tall, white, blonde, blue eyes. And so I think I just wanted to have his voice there because it gives the other flip side of the coin, which is, for me, it was modesty. For him, it was this perfect white ideal that he was never going to be able to achieve. And then him stepping outside of Mormonism to realize so many parts of his body are, his whole body is worthy of loving. And he even talks about how now it's very popular for girls to put fake freckles on, and he has freckles. He loves his freckles. He has so many parts of his body that Mormonism rejected. He's found that outside of this religion, he can connect with parts of the culture, parts of his community, people he sees represented that look like him and beautify the elements of himself that he deserves to see. So I think including all of these stories was important because it allows the reader not to just hear from my experience, but to hear from all of these other perspectives as well, to kind of lift them out of what they've experienced as a Mormon.
That's so interesting. And one of the things that I think the broader culture is so sort of fascinated with about Mormonism is that it is really insular, but it also seems really rigid and rules-based, and there are all these things that are, off limits to Mormons, especially like devout Mormons, or, when you're in an environment like BYU where you have these really strict codes of conduct. And so I'm curious, one of our questions that we wanted to ask you is like, and you talk about this in your content, what's like the favorite thing or some of the favorite things that you've done or been free to do since leaving the church that you couldn't have done before?
Yeah, I think especially taking ownership back of my own body was really important to me. I have my nose ring, which I think to most people is very mundane, but to me was the wildest act of rebellion imaginable. I got a tattoo. This is my husband's. His name is Jackson, so that's a J for him. And I got that maybe, I don't know, I think I'd been out for 6 months or so. And then I have my other piercings. And so I think just in many ways reclaiming my body in that way and saying, I don't actually care if a lot of people think this looks silly or stupid. I like it. And I don't care about if people think tattoos make you look unprofessional. I like it. Or even just that they make you look unchristian or ungodly. I've loved, as a Mormon, my number one thought was always, what would a good Mormon do? And now I can allow myself to just say, what do I want? And I think that's been my greatest gift in my post-Mormon experience, is just finally being able to say, do I like the nose ring? Yes. So I'll do it. And not having to outsource every single decision to God or the book of, there's a For Strength of Youth manual that has all these rules. So I've really loved that.
I love that. Well, that's actually really interesting. And I want to kind of go a little off script because I'm always interested in, I talked with an ex-Mormon lawyer who also was an ex-administrator at BYU. And she was talking about the same kind of concept you're talking about, which is like revelation, where you're speaking or, you're consulting God and God is supposed to speak to you. And I know that's more complicated as a woman once you're married. And maybe you're not as responsible for revelation, but you discussed like consulting God for your big life choices. And me as an atheist, I'm always curious how that feels, because like in my mind, what I think of that as is you're in a way you're consulting yourself. You're looking inside yourself, and you're waiting to hear something inside your mind that directs you what to do. And of course, that's complicated when you're devoutly religious because you're also running it through the filter of like, what do the Mormon rules tell me to do? Like, what would the Mormon God say? It's not just a pure self-reflection. But I'm just curious, like, how you untangle that now as an ex-Mormon who it sounds like maybe doesn't believe in personal revelation from God wherever you're at on the theism spectrum. So like, how do you untangle that in terms of like, what was driving that decision making inside your own mind now looking back, reflecting upon it?
Yeah. And have you always been an atheist?
No, but I had a more traditional religious, like, mainstream Catholic,
right.
Liberal Catholic upbringing. And so I've never been in an insular religious community. So I have never,
okay.
I've
Sorry,
prayed.
I just was curious.
Yeah. So like I've prayed, and would I now reflect back on that? I think of that as wanting something really badly and thinking about it and reflecting on it. But
right.
It's not, not seeking revelation in the way that I think is somewhat unique to Mormons.
Yeah, I think there's a huge emphasis placed on personal revelation. And so when I was growing up, my mom, especially my mom was, I think, my main religious kind of figure in my childhood. And if I ever had a decision to make, she would, say, go pray about it. And I was always kind of confused. The same, similarly, like, how am I going to actually, like, I'm supposed to be receiving direction from the Almighty on high. But I think I would honestly just, they call it the burning in the bosom in the Mormon Church. And I would like feel for a feeling in my gut. I would pray, I would ask the question and pause. And if I felt, I'd honestly, like a coin toss almost, like, should I do this or this? And I'd feel after each one. And if I felt like anything, I mean, I think this is all honestly just like trying to feel some sort of spiritual feeling. I would interpret almost any bodily feeling, like any heart beating faster, stomach kind of turning, to be God. Like, that must be God. And so a lot of these decisions I referenced making are just like me having some small, burning in my chest type feeling and interpreting that to be literally God. And so that now I look back on it and realize, like you said, similarly, it was something I wanted very badly, or it was just, me trying to interpret the most, mundane feelings of my body to be the word of God, or the, I guess, visions or revelation coming down to me.
So sort of on that note, I'm kind of curious about how it was like both changing from this very religious lifestyle to this non-religious one, and how's your kind of stance on religion in general changed during this time?
Yeah, I think I am an atheist, and I think that religion does do some good things, like creating community, and I think the atheist and secular community sometimes has a hard time replicating the level to which religion brings people together. And I recognize that that's something that culturally we haven't figured out yet. There's no replacement per se for Sunday worship or youth activities. You can maybe have kids go to baseball. You can kind of patchwork stuff together, but there's no easy return, just a replacement for religion. But I think ultimately most religions in many ways, I think, do more damage than the good that's caused by the religion. And I think if we consciously as a society can fill those gaps of what religion does provide to the people, to communities, I think that would be a better option. And so, like Mormonism, for example, I had a student when I was teaching in Utah who attempted suicide. And that was because of kids at the school teasing him for being gay. And I don't know if he was gay. He stopped going to the school after that. But, you look at that culture that was created by a religion, and you can't look at that and say, that's good. And you can't even almost balance and say, well, look at all this good and that outweighs it. I think we have to figure out how to find the good aspects of what religion provides and figure out how to do it without needing a dogma that tells you how to live your life.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that. Especially like as someone, I was raised non-religiously, and it was kind of hard to find those things that my peers were getting from like church groups. Because I tried to go to some of those like free thought meetups for families. They just weren't quite the same. And it's kind of interesting to see how society is going to try to get some of those for us non-religious people. So let's go back to your book. So after all of you leaving the church, why did you decide that you needed to write a book?
Yeah, I always wanted to write, and in many ways, choosing to be a teacher that's one of my instances I referred to earlier, where I got a blessing from my dad. That's a Mormon thing where men put their hands on your head and they speak words, and it's called a blessing, and it's supposed to be words from God, not words from the man. So I got a blessing that I was supposed to be a teacher as my primary, as my, what I should major in college, what my career should be, which is a very mom-friendly career. It's not surprising that that was what I was kind of, maybe suggested to do or commanded to do in this blessing. But I always wanted to be a writer. And anytime I would maybe think to myself, oh, I should do writing in college, I would think back on this blessing and say, no, I've received the word from God, and so I'm going to be a teacher. And then fast forward to my first year teaching at American Fork in Utah, and having an absolutely horrible experience on so many different levels, having these experiences with kind of the heart of Mormon culture in this middle school. That was when I really started to question God. And after I left, I really felt like I wanted to reclaim all these dreams I had given up as a member of the church. And so after I left, I always knew I wanted to write a book. And I think in choosing what that book would be, I was inspired just by all these conversations I had with my close ex-Mormon friends and acquaintances, and felt like there really didn't exist anything like this. In all my searching, there's so many books and resources and texts available for people who are looking to research the history claims of the church, stuff about the Book of Abraham, stuff about early temple stuff, Joseph Smith's polygamy, but there were no resources really, from what I could tell, that truly were going to be a guide for someone after they lost their faith. So kind of there's all these texts and resources for losing your faith, for questioning your faith, for deconstructing your faith. But then once all of the pieces lie on the ground, I couldn't find much that's at least text-based. Maybe there was a lot of podcasts, but podcasts are very difficult to topically search through and find what you're looking for. So I basically, long story short, I was inspired to write a book that would have been the book I wanted as I left the church. And so that's what went into this, and the book that I think compiled all the questions I had and that my friends had as they were losing this very intensive lifetime faith.
I'm glad that you brought up the sort of how you structured the book. I think is really interesting because, as you kind of mentioned, you put a bunch of it in. It's not meant to be read in order. You could just go to whatever section that you feel that you need at that moment. There's also a bunch of areas where you can fill in questions, where you're encouraged to journal as part of it. Why did you make that choice to style it that way?
I think I wanted it to not be an indulgent book. I didn't want it to be, I didn't want to be centered as the author and have it just be, because there are a lot of books about, here's my story of leaving the Mormon Church. But I wanted truly it to be an outward facing book that wasn't just, here's Alyssa's story, but here's all the questions you're going to have arise as you leave. And two, I think a lot of people, as you leave the church, you might be ready to question your sexuality and, come out and finally be free in that way. But you might not be ready to try drinking. And that, and I make it clear in the book, you don't have to do any of these things. Just because you leave the church doesn't mean you have to get a nose piercing. But I think education and placing these ideas in front of people and asking them to reflect and consider, am I not doing that purely because I was taught it was a sin? Or am I not doing that or keeping that out of my life because I truly don't want to as an individual? And so I wanted it to be something that is kind of an open, kind of a sounding guide for people to just have ideas presented to them, but then also couched when presenting those ideas with the primary concept, which is you now are making your own path. And it's better don't leave the church and find a new cult or a new thought leader or a new guru. I'm not trying to present myself here as the replacement voice in your head of God, but rather to present lots and lots of ideas so that you can begin to become educated about the choices you're going to make very consciously as you leave the church.
I love that.
Yeah, I love that as well. And I think even as someone who isn't Mormon, it was still a really interesting read. And I think what really made it really fun and interesting is it is very deeply personal in a lot of ways, not just with your stories, but with other people. And I imagine writing that and reflecting back all on that was difficult, but also probably a bit interesting to sort of revisit the way you thought then versus how you think now. How was sort of that experience of doing that?
It was definitely really difficult, but also cathartic, I think, to kind of reflect on these moments from my early experiences leaving the church and wondering what I wish I would have known, and seeing a lot of people. Like I tell the story of the first time I tried drinking, how me and my friend, who also had just left the church, no knowledge about drinking at all, just got so drunk, and it ended in her getting a black eye because she fell, and it was just absolute chaos. And I think in reflecting on those stories, it's kind of embarrassing to share, but also I think I've seen so many Mormons, ex-Mormons, making the same choice where they get into a risky sexual relationship or they experiment with drugs that most people would say, these drugs and alcohol are not, these are, or like even coffee, I think even ex-Mormons often view the spectrum of substances as coffee is the same as alcohol, is the same as addictive pain pills. And it's all the same because it was all said, just this is all sinful. There is no education or understanding that getting into different things actually does carry greater risks or lower risks. Like coffee is not as risky. And I think for secular people, it's like, duh, of course coffee is not as risky. But to ex-Mormons, new ex-Mormons, it really can feel, as far as taboos go and as far as sins go, it's all the same. And so I really wanted to have some of these maybe embarrassing stories or personal stories or stories that kind of expose my experience, because I think they reveal in many ways what a lot of people face as they leave and how they have to kind of relearn the world and really consciously make decisions that make you more free, but don't also lead down a really awful path that's just in the opposite direction.
I did want to mention as you mentioned earlier, you have a family, and your dedication in the book is to your husband Jackson and to your sons. This book is for you. I'm proud you'll never need to read it. I thought that was a really kind of wonderful dedication, and I kind of wanted to ask about how raising your family non-Mormon has been, and how jarring that has been from what your expectations of what raising your children was going to be like.
Yeah, I think prior to me, my family lineage in Mormonism goes back to Joseph Smith. So I have on my mom's side, I've been Mormon since Joseph Smith. And in many ways, that makes me such a black sheep, and in Mormonism, it's very much viewed as like dropping the flag. Like, everybody's kind of staying strong and you're the one that's slipping off, But I think for me, I also recognize like the way I view it is that I broke the chain, and that all of my ancestors chose to stay in a church that denied priesthood from Black people, that didn't give priesthood to women and kept women in their place and often abused women and kind of forced them into polygamous relationships back, when polygamy was still practiced in the church that like my ancestors, and my ancestors stayed in the church despite all of these instances that I think I wish they would have questioned. And in many ways, there was so little access to information, I don't even know that they really had the ability to question like I did when I can go and Google things. And so I think the gift I give my children is that they don't have to have the burden of leaving the church. They don't have to have the burden of, I have 2 sons, serving a 2-year Mormon mission. That is a huge commitment and ultimately waste of time if the church is not true. And so I think the gift I give them is that I did the hard thing of leaving my community so that they can have a clean slate and truly choose whatever they want from this beautiful world and not be kind of forced to participate in a religion that I choose for them. And so that's, I think, a beautiful gift to give my own children.
Yeah, I definitely agree. As someone who was raised non-religiously, I think it was a very kind thing that my parents did for me. So I'm very glad you're giving that to your children as well.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, Alyssa. I am also a parent of 3 sons, and I know that like we're not all raised in insular religious cults, but so many of us are trying to break cycles for our children, and it's hard in a lot of contexts, but obviously leaving a religious cult where your family may or may not disown you has got to be really, really hard. And so my hat is off to you. And that's a really beautiful thought.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, and I think I've actually known ex-Mormons who continue to take their kids to church because they feel like their children need religion in their lives. And I almost feel like it's like it's like passing on the pain, because ultimately Mormonism is very easy to prove wrong. The Book of Mormon is quite easy to prove that it wasn't a historic document from the Native Americans when, like Joseph Smith said it was. There's a lot of anachronisms in it. There's a lot of evidence to support that it is just a document Joseph Smith made up. And so I think anyone who no longer believes but still teaches their children this, I really question, because ultimately, if you don't believe, your children will likely come to the same conclusion and will also have to face what I faced, which is deconstructing all of these things they've learned from their religion as the absolute truth. And so I think the kindest thing to do is to take one for the team, almost like the heritage team, and I'll be the one. I will take the pain of what it means to leave the church so that you can have this happy, carefree life and you never have to face this decision.
Love that. I'm going to see if we have any questions coming in, Alyssa. So from Facebook.
Okay.
And see if there's anything interesting here to talk about before the hour's out. So this is a question I think a lot of people will be curious about. So I'm going to ask it, which is on this subject of leaving and breaking that community. How did your family of origin and your husband react to your leaving Mormonism and writing your book?
Yeah, so my husband was raised in what they call a part member family. So his mom was not Mormon and his dad was, and they were divorced. So I think he just had a much broader experience as a child with more viewpoints, being raised like that. And so when we were first dating, he actually, I told him I thought gay people shouldn't be able to get married. And that was one of our first disagreements when we were dating, because he said, your religious belief shouldn't dictate the rights of other people. And I remember just stumbling over my words, like not expecting him to push back because I was so used to all Mormons just responding in the same way. And so he, I think, in a lot of ways, introduced some of these perspectives that allowed me to start to question. And I think, too, when I first told him, he said he still wanted to go, even though I didn't want to go. And then as we started having more conversations and doing a lot of reading into church history and conversations about our experiences with the religion, I think I kind of introduced the idea, but then he was ready to leave faster. And so he was totally fine with it. My older sister, she was out of the church before me, so she really also paved the way in many ways. Two of my siblings are still in the church. My parents are both still in the church. And I think it's been very hard on them, honestly. They've been, to their credit, very loving and very accepting. It's just something we absolutely don't talk about. So it's just almost like the third rail of like our family culture is we'll talk about the church, but we haven't really talked about this. And so I did let them know. They know it exists. Excuse me. But I think at this point they are trying to, like I said, to their credit, have our family personal relationship over here and their experience in the church over here, and hopefully be able to just almost blinders up, not go head first into it. And that does make me sad. Like I'd love for my parents to be able to, especially my mom, like be really proud of me. I have over 100,000 followers between my accounts, and I have millions of people watching and thousands of people commenting about how my information and content and stories have helped them feel hope. But honestly, it's so strange to have people online say like, hey, this is awesome. I love this. This is amazing. This is so empowering. And then to have my mom, for example, saying, this is deeply hurtful and I wish you would stop. So I think it's been very difficult to navigate, and I think we kind of default to not talking about it, but it is really challenging, and it's hard to know that I am letting them down, even if I'm doing something I believe in.
That's so hard, and a relatable experience, even if not in this exact context, you know. Generational change is really hard in a lot of contexts, and it is really hard and painful. I'm really proud of you. I think this book is a triumph, and I'm a stranger to you and you don't care, but it's beautiful. It's a triumph, and I think you should be really proud of what you're doing and what you're creating.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
So here's a couple more questions. Do you ever, or did you ever try to encourage friends from the church to leave or to, I mean, obviously you wrote this book, but do you feel like you have that role with any of your friends in the Mormon Church?
So I will say often when people leave, it's very common to experience just kind of, it maybe the Mormon version of disfellowshipping, shunning, that, like, I served a 1.5-year mission. I had so many mission companions. None of them speak to me. And that's not even from the social media thing. That's from when I first left. And I think there's basically, I think, an understanding that when you leave the church, you're essentially poisoned in some way. Like you have some knowledge or you made some unfaithful choice. And so you're kind of a little bit treated like a leper. I think especially for people outside of your immediate family who are like, I don't want to be infected by whatever infected you, so I'm just going to cut off contact. And I really, if I still had close Mormon friends, maybe I would try to, evangelize them in the opposite direction. But I really had a hard time maintaining any of those friendships after I left the church above, maybe a Facebook comment like, good job, or like a hello in public. And as far as my family goes, I have had some conversations with my sisters and even my parents about some of these things. And I think it adds to maybe their nuance of how they view the faith. But I wouldn't say I've gone so far as to try to actively convince my family to leave, purely because I think it would be so poorly received that I'm not willing to risk the relationship in that way.
Yeah. Okay, one last question. Do you feel like a part of you is still influenced by the church, or do you feel fully liberated?
I think it's kind of impossible to say. I think it's impossible to know what anyone would be like raised in a vacuum, because
Totally.
all of us have, whether it was your parents, a teacher, friends, media you consumed. For me, my religion, that was so part of my upbringing. And I talk about this when I talk about becoming a mom, that it's really impossible to truly dissect your motives for making a certain choice, because ultimately you're a product of your upbringing and your entire life. And so sometimes I'll make a choice and feel like that was me being so liberated. And then I'll look back and say, like, I think that was actually just me responding to wanting to be as opposite of Mormonism as possible, which is still being influenced by Mormonism. It's just wanting to reject it versus be a part of it. So it's still like, neither of those things are choices I'm now making in the vacuum of having no influence. But I do think about that a lot. And I think it's impossible to fully disentangle the influences of something quite as powerful as my church was in my upbringing.
Yeah. Well, Alyssa, we so appreciate you talking to us and sharing your experience with us. And again, just one more time, your book.
You can also follow Alyssa both on TikTok and Instagram. I think it's TikTok and YouTube, sorry. I think it's highly worth it. I think the stories are really great. The information's really interesting. So go ahead and give her a follow online.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's funny and it's honest and it's helping people. And check out her book, How to Leave the Mormon Church. And thank you so much for speaking with us, Alyssa. That will conclude Ask an Atheist for this week. Don't forget, we also have a weekly broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters. This week, Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker speak to U.S. Representative Jared Huffman, the co-founder of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. Here he examines the record of House Speaker Mike Johnson.
If you take a look at what Speaker Johnson has done throughout his career as an attorney representing some of these organizations, including designated hate groups, in their agenda to impose biblical codes, broadly on society, his obsession with these biblical code-driven policies that he wants to implement. I mean, he's obsessed with banning abortion, of course. He's obsessed with homosexuality, which he regards as a sin that is going to bring, broad societal wrath from God on all of us. And, if he wants to have these extreme beliefs in his personal life, that's one thing. If he wants to be a lawyer and advocate for these things, he can do that too. But when you step into the role of being a legislator, and certainly as the Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, it's not okay to advance these types of agendas because they are fundamentally at odds with who we are as a country.
You can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels.
And don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week, Dan and Annie Laurie will speak to Robin Voss, author of The Index of Prohibited Books. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio.
And check out the latest episode of our We Dissent podcast. Our latest episode, me and FFRF Legal Director Rebecca Markert answer listener questions. And a brand new episode about 2024 state legislation drops a week from today. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get podcasts. Check us out online at we-dissent.org.
If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us.
See you next week on Ask an Atheist.